Welcome to the ninth installment of Theory Chats, an interactive companion to the 2024 book, The Theory Story Reader for Social Studies, published with Teachers College Press. We hope this abbreviated conversation will pique people's interest about how the book approaches, stories, and applies theory to social studies education. If it happens to do so, the volume is available at all major online retailers or by going directly to tcpress.com and searching for the title. Brett and I are also more than happy to answer any questions related to the project, so please feel free to contact us. Today's guest is Dr. Sarah Shear, who will be talking about settler colonialism, which is highlighted in her chapter.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Shear. It's great to see you as always. Would
Great
you
to
mind
see you.
introducing yourself and then start by telling us a little bit about how you arrived to or depart from theory in your research and or teaching?
Well, it's great to be with both of you and all your viewers. And again, I'm Sarah Shear. I'm at the University of Washington, Bothell, and I want to acknowledge that I'm calling in from where I live and work, that are the homelands and waters of many shared Native nations, including the Muckleshoot, the Snoqualmie, the Stillaguamish, the Suquamish, and the Tulalip nations. And I say that in order to recognize that settler colonialism, which was the centerpiece of my chapter and the centerpiece of my work, seeks to understand and to acknowledge and to do what we can to work to counter settler colonialism in the sense of that we all live on occupied indigenous lands, that the creation of the United States, in my particular context, but we can also look to other nations around the world that have settler origins as nation states, right? That our countries were built on top of other nations and peoples who were already here. And so acknowledging where I live and work is very important as part of my efforts to be alongside Indigenous peoples who have been advocating for their sovereignty and their rights and their traditions since time immemorial. And I particularly love to do this work in social studies because of so much of what we do, right? Teaching history and teaching civics and geography and economics and the social sciences and trying to understand the world around us and how we all came to be here, and particularly to think about the current context with which we find ourselves, in 2024, ahead of a presidential election, as well as elections for the Senate and House and, up and down the ballot. What kind of nation is the United States going to be? What kind of nation has the United States been? And how can we think of settler colonial theory as a way to help, as a lens with which to analyze how we got here.
Wonderful, thank you. So to follow up on that, so thinking of settler colonialism as a lens, can you tell us a little bit more about what settler colonialism means and how you use it in your theorizing?
Sure. So settler colonial theory and settler colonialism, if we think about it as Patrick Wolfe and others have written, is a structure, right? We're not thinking of a singular event where we may, as the event may be, right, the arrival of Columbus to the Caribbean, or the quote unquote age of exploration, or the Industrial Revolution, right? These events that took place, both in what created the United States as a country and, impacted the world, for everyone. And what Patrick Wolfe and others have written about, right, it's not just a single event. It's many events that create a structure of how, particularly a nation state. And so I'm going to continue to kind of just think and center us in the United States, because that's where I do my work and think about my work in helping social studies teachers. But we can think about it globally as well, right? In the mindset of the Europeans in particular coming to what became the United States, what was the driving ideology in their leaving their home territories and going to expand and claim, right, what became, the United States and the states that we live in. And so thinking about this as a lens of understanding what drove them to do that and the events that came from that ideology, right? It's it's not so much we often talk about, right? It's not, words are important, but actions sometimes, I think, are really the teller of what we believe. right? And so we can go all the way back in thinking about settler colonialism as a structure that helped create the United States, in thinking about the ways that the monarchies of Europe um, were operating in a frame of white supremacy, of Christian supremacy, and particularly if we're thinking about the English, right, or the United Kingdom or Great Britain, that largely became, the controlling monarchy here in what became the United States. But France was also part of that, Spain, Portugal, other European countries, but also thinking about religion, language, race, socioeconomics, all of these factors that make a person, that make a monarchy, make a nation, right? Thinking about that in terms of creating the dominant and the other, and then acting in according to that ideology. And so thinking about settler colonialism as a string of events rooted in an ideology of superiority helps us analyze how the United States became a nation state, and how it continues to operate in a legal sense, in a cultural sense, and in many ways, it's also a partner lens to critical race theory, right? In understanding how our legal system here in the United States was built on and founded in supremacist ideology, and how that not only impacts people of color, indigenous people, women, the LGBT community, right? These supremacist ideologies, but how they also continue to function in a contemporary context.
Yeah, that's really great. And I hope our viewers find that to be really helpful in thinking about not just the underpinnings of the theory, but also the possibilities, which I think you did such a great job of laying out for us. So thank you so much for that really thoughtful response. As the book is inspired around Deleuze's suggestion of being on the lookout, what are some ways that theory reveals itself to you in your own life outside of the classroom or spaces where you conduct your research?
Thank you. And this is one of the things I loved so much about writing the chapter for this book is being able to think about settler colonial theory just as I walk around my house and around my yard. Um, and it's academic, but also very, very personal, very human, very more than human. And in my chapter, I write about ivy, or English ivy, as a way with which to kind of help people think about what colonialism is, and how it manifests. And one of the important things that I think about with English ivy is that it was brought here, right? It was brought here by the Europeans, right, to make the landscape here. And just thinking about here being the Pacific Northwest, right? English ivy is not a native plant to this area. It's an invasive plant. It was brought here because the Europeans who settled and occupied this area wanted some of their home landscape to look at. And so English ivy has been a very detrimental plant in this area because of the way that it grows. And I include a picture in my chapter of the impact that ivy has on, particularly on trees, especially elder trees, 150 plus year old trees. And the thing that I've learned about ivy living here in the Pacific Northwest is when it takes root, its roots are extremely strong and go very deep. But it's a climber, right? We know ivy is a climbing plant, so it has to have something to climb on. And what we've seen here in the Pacific Northwest, and I see every day when I go in my yard trying to fight the ivy, is that it will, excuse me, it will cling to these big cedar and big Douglas fir trees and climb it. And the thing that is scary about the English ivy in this sense is that it has very because it's a climber, it has these like kind of like claws, right? And it attaches and digs into the bark. And as it's climbing, it strangles, right? It squeezes in order to nourish itself off of the tree. Ultimately killing, it can kill, it can kill a tree, it can kill the other landscape around it, because it not only climbs, but it spreads if it's not, it's checked. And I think about the ivy in my yard as this kind of story of settler colonialism because it was brought here by people seeking to claim what was not theirs, right? In taking and occupying space, taking of resources, claiming of bodies, whether human or more than human. So thinking of the tree, right? Claiming it to extract its resources so that the ivy, right, or the settlers can survive and thrive. And the only way that I have learned through studying, resources shared by the state here on getting rid of the ivy and controlling the ivy is that it's not just that the ivy needs to be, physically taken off the trees and the roots dug out, but you can't just throw it. You can't just throw it in the yard bin because it will start growing there. It will retake roots. It needs like a physical barrier between the ivy needs a physical barrier between itself and the ground or other nutrients with which it can then root again. And so it has to be laid out, for example, on a tarp in the sun until it completely dries out. And I think about settler colonial theory as a lens with which to examine, social studies, education, curriculum in particular, in this kind of root system, right? What is the story? What is the worldview that we are bringing into our classrooms? What is the root? What is the root that's taking hold in our students from early birth all through 12th grade in the US into higher education? What is the worldview that they are being rooted in and then being fed? And what interventions do we need, particularly in our current context, in understanding that settler colonialism, racism, sexism, transphobia, all of these really detrimental ideologies that impact people's lives negatively? What are the interventions that we need to understand that we all need as adults and different kinds of learning spaces our students need, so that really harmful ideology doesn't not only doesn't take root, but doesn't flourish. And so I think about that a lot as I'm out in the yard just every day. And it's an everyday practice, right? There's no magical, unlike the Matrix movies, right? Where you have to pick your pill and, once you see it, you'll you'll never not see the Matrix, right? I wish there was something to be like, yeah, if you just do this, it'll all be okay. But what I've learned, not only from my work and my partnerships with many brilliant scholars in Indigenous studies and social studies and other areas of scholarship and teaching, but just life too, in the things that I've learned, is that it's an everyday practice. It's an everyday waking up to consciously think, how am I approaching life today? How am I engaging with people? How am I taking ownership, responsibility for the privileges that I have as a non-Indigenous white person in the United States? And how do I continue to unlearn the things that I was taught or grew up thinking that are actually, detrimental or harmful to other people? And how do I just keep trying every day, right, to change and to be better? And I think about that too when I'm in the yard, right? And like I see the ivy popping out of the ground. Okay, it's time to go out and do another intervention. And so, it's trying every day, and working every day with our students and our partners to say, let's try to understand how we got here and the ideology that rooted that, and then what can we do once we understand what that is.
Wow, thank you so much. The English ivy, like what a helpful metaphor, material metaphor for thinking about settler colonialism and those everyday practices that we must engage in. And that really exemplifies, I think, our sort of ethic of being on the lookout. So thank you so much. Thank you again for your contribution to the project and for being so generous with your time. We hope viewers and listeners today will seek out the book in order to think more about settler colonialism and the many partner lenses that help us think and see various structures operating throughout history and society. We strongly encourage everyone to be on the lookout for Dr. Shear's scholarship, which appears in numerous journals, chapters, and edited books, including Marking the Invisible, Articulating Whiteness in Social Studies, Reimagining Elementary Social Studies, a Controversial Issues Reader, and Insurgent Social Studies, Social Studies Scholar Educators Disrupting Erasure and Marginality.
Thanks again, everyone, for joining us. Until we chat again.